Deportation to danger? U.S. court halts. Migrant flights to Libya amid global condemnation. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we go beyond the headlines to uncover the truth, challenge injustice, and amplify Africa's voice on the global stage. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today we take you deep into a breaking story making waves across the world: the blocked U.S. plan to deport migrants to Libya. What does this mean for Africa, for international law, and for the future of global migration? Stay with us. A United States federal judge in Boston has temporarily halted a Trump administration initiative to deport undocumented migrants to Libya, citing a violation of due process rights. The decision, delivered by U.S. District Judge Brian Murphy, underscores escalating legal and human rights tensions surrounding President Donald Trump's controversial immigration crackdown. The judge's ruling comes in response to an emergency court petition filed by immigration lawyers after credible reports emerged that flights were being prepared to forcibly remove migrants to the North African country. In his ruling, Judge Murphy stated the plan blatantly defies a prior injunction he issued, which mandates that migrants must be given written notice in a language they understand and provided with a meaningful opportunity to file claims against removal. The case reflects broader constitutional and humanitarian implications as the Trump administration doubles down on mass deportation policies under executive authority and obscure legal precedents, including wartime statutes. Libya, a country in crisis, not a safe haven. Libya, once a wealthy, oil-rich North African nation, has descended into political chaos since the 2011 NATO-backed ousting of longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi. Today, the country remains split between two rival administrations: the UN-recognized Government of National Unity, led by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh in the west, and the Libyan National Army faction under General Khalifa Haftar in the east. Prime Minister Dbeibeh took to social media platform X, formerly Twitter, categorically rejecting any plan that would see Libya become a dumping ground for foreign migrants, asserting that Libya refuses to be a destination for the deportation of migrants under any pretext. The U.S. State Department, which currently warns its citizens against travel to Libya due to terrorism, kidnapping, and civil unrest, has so far declined to comment on the reports. Notably, two anonymous U.S. officials told CBS News that deportation flights could commence as early as this week, raising alarms across legal, diplomatic, and human rights circles. Legal versus executive power, a repeat of past clashes. This legal confrontation bears striking similarities to the 2017 judicial blocks against Trump's travel ban targeting Muslim-majority countries. Then, as now, federal courts played a vital role in checking executive overreach. Judge Murphy's temporary restraining order represents a fresh judicial rebuke of immigration tactics that many legal scholars argue skirt international refugee conventions and violate domestic constitutional protections. The use of a centuries-old wartime law to fast-track deportations, as reported by multiple outlets, adds a new and alarming dimension. This suggests a willingness to override established asylum procedures, bypass immigration courts, and exert extraordinary federal powers to enforce controversial migration policies. African reactions, continental implications, and diplomatic shockwaves. Libya is not the only African country caught in the dragnet of U.S. deportation plans. According to multiple media reports, other nations approached by Washington include Rwanda, Benin, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and Eswatini. Rwanda confirmed it is in preliminary discussions with the U.S., though no formal agreement has been reached. The implications for Africa are significant. Rwanda has a history of hosting deported migrants, including those sent from the UK under the now infamous Rwanda deal. However, human rights watchdogs have raised concerns about lack of due process and poor resettlement infrastructure. Benin and Angola, both facing internal economic and governance challenges, are unlikely to welcome large numbers of deportees without international scrutiny or aid. Eswatini, a small monarchy, and Equatorial Guinea, often criticized for authoritarian rule, may face backlash if they agree to such arrangements without public transparency. If Libya, still reeling from civil war, militia rule, and human trafficking networks, is being considered a safe destination, the credibility of these assessments by U.S. immigration authorities comes into question. International law mandates that deportations cannot be carried out to countries where returnees face a credible threat of torture, abuse, or inhumane treatment. A standard Libya arguably fails. Forward-looking concerns. What this means for global migration policy. This case marks a potential turning point in the global debate over migrant returns to unsafe third countries. Analysts argue that it signals 1. A shift from safe third country agreements to transactional diplomacy, where countries with weak institutional frameworks are approached with financial or political incentives to accept deportees. 2. A collapse in global refugee protection norms. If powerful nations like the US begin mass deportations to unstable zones, it may embolden others to follow suit, risking the erosion of asylum frameworks under the 1951 Refugee Convention. 3. Growing weaponization of migration in geopolitics. Libya, Rwanda, and others may leverage their cooperation on deportation deals to extract concessions from Washington, including military aid, diplomatic recognition, or debt relief. 4. Legal activism on the rise. Courts remain the last line of defense against arbitrary executive actions. This case will likely prompt more robust legal coalitions to form across U.S. states and international legal bodies. Africa-wide political responses. Between sovereignty and solidarity. The U.S. proposition to offload migrants to Libya and other African nations is not merely an immigration issue. It is a profound diplomatic challenge for the African continent. As news of the potential deportation spread, several African civil society organizations, regional blocs, and governments began signaling discomfort, and in some cases, outright opposition. African Union, AU, response. Tensions mount. While the African Union Commission has not yet released an official communiqué, multiple diplomatic sources confirm that the AU's Peace and Security Council has scheduled an emergency closed-door meeting to discuss the legality and ethical implications of the U.S. deportation scheme. Senior AU officials, speaking on background, expressed concerns that the U.S. strategy undermines Africa's sovereignty and risks reducing the continent to a receptacle for failed Western migration policies. An AU diplomat in Addis Ababa, speaking to the Bold African Voice, BAV, noted, "We cannot remain silent while external actors treat African states as convenient drop zones for their domestic problems. Any agreement reached outside the framework of bilateral respect and human dignity will have long-term repercussions." This sentiment echoes past controversies over Europe's outsourcing of migration control to African states, such as Italy and Libya's notorious 2017 cooperation agreement, which drew global outrage due to documented abuses of migrants in Libyan detention centers. ECOWAS and SADC, silent but watching. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the Southern African Development Community, SADC, have not formally commented, but several member states, particularly Benin, Angola, and Eswatini, have begun internal assessments of the political fallout that could arise from accepting deportees. Civil society activists in Benin, for instance, argue that the country is already grappling with youth unemployment, weak infrastructure, and inflationary pressures. Adding thousands of undocumented foreign nationals to this equation could destabilize fragile urban centers. In Eswatini, opposition voices point to the regime's desire for Western legitimacy and fear that agreeing to a U.S. migrant pact could be perceived as selling out the nation's sovereignty for financial favors. Civil society backlash and protests. Human rights organizations across Africa and the diaspora have mobilized rapidly. Prominent groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, African Refugee Defense Coalition, and Refugees International have issued urgent statements condemning the proposed deportations. In Rwanda, protesters gathered in Kigali's central square, holding banners reading, "Rwanda is not for sale, and refugees deserve dignity, not deportation." A parallel digital campaign, No to Forced Returns, trended across African Twitter X, garnering support from influential figures including Nobel laureates, religious leaders, and former AU envoys. In Nigeria, where a significant portion of undocumented African migrants in the U.S. originate, prominent lawyers and activists have warned that any quiet acceptance of deportees without thorough vetting could violate both international conventions and national refugee law. A Lagos-based immigration attorney told BAV the U.S. cannot use its geopolitical muscle to sidestep human rights responsibilities. If these deportees are forced into countries without their consent or proper documentation, it constitutes unlawful refoulement. Geopolitical risks, undermining Africa-U.S. relations. The broader diplomatic risks for Washington are considerable. Several African nations have expressed growing frustration with U.S. foreign policy, which they see as increasingly transactional and unilateral. The deportation proposal may exacerbate this perception. Already, key African partners in the Prosper Africa Trade Initiative and the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, are reevaluating future cooperation amid fears that U.S. policy is shifting away from partnership toward imposition. Former Ghanaian Foreign Minister Hannah Tete, now serving as a UN Special Representative, criticized the U.S. plan at a recent African Development Forum. "We cannot accept policies that externalize crises at our expense. Migration must be handled through dialogue, justice, and respect for human dignity, not militarized logistics and airlifts to war zones." The reputational fallout for the United States could also impact its lobbying efforts for influence at the UN, where African votes are critical. Countries courted by Washington for strategic partnerships, including for rare earth mining and counterterrorism, may now pause or reverse course if trust is eroded. Historical parallels, lessons from past deportation deals. The current U.S. push to deport migrants to unstable or unwilling African nations is not without precedent. Historically, powerful nations have offshored immigration enforcement to poorer, geopolitically vulnerable states, often under the guise of development aid, security cooperation, or burden sharing. One prominent example is the 2003 U.S. Haitian deportation campaign, where thousands of Haitian nationals were returned to a nation reeling from political instability and economic collapse. Despite warnings from human rights groups, the deportations went ahead, and many returnees faced extortion, detention, and violence upon arrival. Years later, similar tactics were used under the Remain in Mexico policy, where asylum seekers were forced to wait in dangerous border towns with little protection. In the European context, the EU-Turkey refugee deal of 2016 involved the European Union providing billions of euros to Ankara in exchange for accepting deported Syrian refugees. Though it stemmed the tide of arrivals into Europe, it sparked intense criticism for enabling pushbacks and legitimizing unsafe returns. Similarly, Italy's 2017 migration accord with Libya, which saw the Libyan Coast Guard intercept and return migrants at sea, was condemned for subjecting migrants to torture, slavery, and rape in detention camps. These past arrangements are now being cited by legal scholars and advocates as cautionary tales against replicating flawed and dangerous policies. The U.S. attempt to deport migrants to Libya echoes these controversial deals and risks setting a new international precedent where legal and ethical responsibilities toward migrants are outsourced to nations least equipped to uphold them. Legal implications, due process, refoulement, and international law. Judge Brian Murphy's ruling in Boston not only halts immediate deportations, but may also lay the groundwork for a broader legal confrontation over the limits of executive authority in immigration enforcement. Central to the debate is whether migrants, particularly those already in the U.S., retain constitutional protections such as the right to a fair hearing and legal representation. More specifically, lawyers have invoked the principle of non-refoulement, enshrined in Article 33 of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which prohibits the return of individuals to a country where they face threats to life or freedom. Libya, by all credible international assessments, qualifies as such a country. A joint statement by the UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, IOM, and OHCHR in 2023 reiterated that Libya is not a safe port of return for migrants. Detention, extortion, trafficking, and arbitrary violence remain widespread in both eastern and western regions of the country. Legal experts warn that forcing deportations to Libya could amount to state-sanctioned refoulement, opening the U.S. to international legal challenges at forums such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights or even the UN Human Rights Council. Some civil liberties groups are preparing amicus briefs and class action suits, seeking long-term judicial review of the administration's broader deportation campaign. Meanwhile, immigration law professors at institutions like Yale and Georgetown have begun tracking cases that may rise to the U.S. Supreme Court, especially if deportation practices continue to push legal boundaries. A constitutional showdown may be looming on whether executive wartime powers can override international human rights obligations during peacetime immigration enforcement. Economic calculations. What's in it for African governments? Beyond legality and diplomacy lies a practical concern. Why would African nations agree to accept U.S. deportees, especially those with no direct ties to their populations? Initial reporting suggests that Washington may offer economic incentives such as direct financial aid, infrastructure investments, or expanded visa access for select nationals. However, the cost-benefit analysis for many African states is not straightforward. Key considerations for African governments include public backlash. Accepting U.S. deportees without transparency could provoke domestic unrest, particularly in countries already facing anti-government sentiment and economic hardship. Capacity constraints. Most African countries lack the infrastructure to process, house, or integrate large groups of stateless or undocumented migrants. This could exacerbate urban unemployment, strain public services, and trigger localized conflict. Sovereignty concerns. Nations such as Algeria and Ghana have historically rejected deportation deals that threaten national dignity or could be perceived as neo-colonial impositions. Diplomatic trade-offs. Aligning with the U.S. on deportations may alienate these countries from EU partners, African regional bodies, or even China, which positions itself as a non-interfering development ally. In some cases, leaders may be tempted by short-term economic gains, especially ahead of national elections or during IMF loan negotiations. Yet, the long-term political risk of being seen as complicit in human rights violations may outweigh any immediate benefit. The road ahead. toward an African migration framework? As the crisis unfolds, several African thinkers and policy analysts are calling for a Pan-African migration framework, one that prioritizes dignity, regional coordination, and continental solutions. Such a framework could include a continent-wide legal mechanism to determine how and under what conditions deported Africans can be received, processed, or resettled. A migration observatory, potentially housed under the African Union, to monitor deportation trends and assess legal compliance. Bilateral and multilateral safeguards to prevent the externalization of migration management by Western powers. Stronger partnerships between African states and the UN refugee system to ensure returns are voluntary, safe, and dignified, not coerced. Several countries, including South Africa, Senegal, and Kenya, are expected to raise these issues at the upcoming AU-EU Migration and Development Forum scheduled for later this year. U.S. domestic political implications, immigration as a 2024 campaign flashpoint. Within the United States, the Libya deportation controversy is unfolding amid a highly polarized political climate. With the 2024 presidential election cycle in full swing, immigration has once again become a defining wedge issue, particularly for former President Donald Trump, who is seeking a return to office on a platform heavily focused on border control and deportation. The attempt to deport migrants to Libya and potentially other African nations is viewed by critics as a dramatic escalation intended to rally Trump's base. His campaign speeches have revived slogans such as America First and Secure Our Borders, often paired with claims that undocumented migrants pose economic and security threats to the nation. However, the Boston court ruling and broader public backlash are fueling significant legal and political resistance. Congressional Democrats, alongside a growing number of moderate Republicans, have condemned the move as inhumane and constitutionally suspect. Several have introduced emergency resolutions to block federal funding for any deportation flights to countries with active conflict warnings. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, DNY, called the deportation plan a grotesque abuse of executive power, while Senator Cory Booker, DNJ, stated, "No human being should be forcibly returned to a war zone. This is not security, it's state-sponsored cruelty." Meanwhile, legal advocacy organizations such as the ACLU, National Immigration Law Center, and American Immigration Council are coordinating nationwide legal strategies to challenge the broader deportation agenda, anticipating an eventual Supreme Court showdown. Electoral fallout and policy gridlock. The controversy may also deepen divisions within the Republican Party itself. While the Trump-aligned faction remains supportive of aggressive deportation tactics, a growing segment of conservative policymakers, especially those with ties to the business and faith communities, are concerned about the reputational and economic consequences of mass removals. These policymakers argue that many undocumented migrants play crucial roles in the U.S. labor market, particularly in agriculture, construction, caregiving, and service industries. Deporting them en masse, particularly under ethically questionable conditions, risks triggering labor shortages and driving up inflation in key states like Florida, Texas, and California. From a legislative perspective, the deportation plan may grind ongoing immigration reform discussions in Congress to a halt. Bipartisan efforts to provide pathways to citizenship for DACA recipients and agricultural workers now risk being overshadowed by the political firestorm surrounding forced removals to volatile countries. African diaspora, mobilization, advocacy. Across borders, across the US, Europe, and within Africa, the African diaspora has emerged as a powerful voice opposing the deportation of migrants to Libya and other vulnerable nations. From grassroots protests to formal lobbying efforts, communities are increasingly organizing to push back against what they see as racialized and exploitative immigration practices, protests, and public outcry. In major U.S. cities like Washington, D.C., New York, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles, African immigrant groups have held coordinated protests outside federal courts, ICE detention centers, and state capitol buildings. Activists carry signs with messages like, Black immigrants matter, Libya is not safe, and stop the deportation flights. Organizations such as the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, and African Communities Together, ACT, have held press conferences, community town halls, and online advocacy campaigns to highlight the unique vulnerabilities of African and Caribbean migrants in U.S. immigration enforcement. A Sierra Leonean community leader in Maryland told the Bold African Voice, BAV, "These are not just statistics. They're our brothers and sisters. Deporting them to a failed state is unconscionable. We won't be silent." Transnational solidarity movements. The outrage has extended beyond U.S. borders. In Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany, African diaspora organizations have begun forming transnational advocacy coalitions to document abuses, publish open letters, and press Western governments to intervene diplomatically. At a recent online forum hosted by the African Diaspora Policy Center, ADPC, in The Hague, scholars and activists warned that the mass deportation of African migrants, especially under coercive or opaque agreements, could have ripple effects for African integration efforts and migration governance across the continent. These groups are also pressuring the African Union to adopt a more assertive stance, calling for a continental framework to protect the rights of African migrants globally, including those facing deportation from the US, Europe, and the Middle East. The media's role, narratives, visibility, and accountability coverage of the Libya deportation plan has varied widely depending on media source. While international outlets like the BBC, Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle, and France 24 have provided in-depth reporting on the humanitarian risks, many U.S. mainstream networks have framed the issue primarily as a domestic legal matter. Independent African media platforms, including the Bold African Voice, BAV, African Arguments, The Continent, and OK Africa, have stepped into the vacuum, offering nuanced coverage that connects the dots between U.S. immigration policy, African state cooperation, and the lived experiences of migrants. Digital campaigns on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter, are playing a key role in amplifying migrant voices, documenting detention conditions, and raising awareness about countries being targeted for removals. The rise of citizen journalism, particularly among African youth and diaspora influencers, is helping to counter disinformation and ensure the world sees deportations for what they are. Not just law enforcement actions, but morally and politically consequential decisions with real human costs. Future scenarios, migration policy at a crossroads. The halted Libya deportation plan stands at the intersection of law, diplomacy, and human rights, exposing deeper structural flaws in how migration is managed between the global north and Africa. As the situation unfolds, several possible scenarios are emerging, each with its own geopolitical, legal, and ethical consequences. Scenario 1. Court-ordered halt becomes permanent. If the U.S. judiciary upholds the injunction and rules that deporting migrants to Libya violates both domestic due process and international law, the deportation plan may collapse entirely. This outcome would embolden human rights advocates and set a strong legal precedent against removals to conflict zones. However, this could also trigger a backlash from immigration hardliners in Congress and the Trump campaign, who may push for legislative workarounds or invoke emergency executive powers. A constitutional crisis could follow if the administration attempts to override judicial authority. Scenario 2. Quiet, bilateral agreements proceed. Under the radar, despite legal obstacles, the administration may continue pursuing quiet deals with willing African governments, particularly those in economic distress or reliant on U.S. aid. Deportations could resume in modified forms, targeting migrants from countries with fewer protections or weaker diaspora mobilization. This covert approach risks undermining transparency and, without robust oversight mechanisms, could lead to rights abuses, statelessness, and re traumatization for deportees. It may also strain African governments domestically as citizens protest perceived collusion with Western powers. Scenario 3. African governments and AU pushback. Under growing pressure from civil society and diaspora communities, some African nations may adopt a coordinated strategy to refuse participation in U.S. deportation programs. The African Union could invoke its Charter on Human and People's Rights, declaring such deportations a violation of continental norms. In this scenario, African states may call for global reform of migrant return frameworks, demanding more humane, rights-based, and voluntary repatriation processes, possibly leveraging the Global Compact for Migration as a platform. This could lead to stronger continental unity on migration governance, but also risks diplomatic fallout with the U.S., especially if tied to development funding or military cooperation. Scenario 4. Shift toward multilateral humanitarian solutions. Faced with mounting legal, diplomatic, and reputational costs, the U.S. may eventually pivot toward multilateral engagement, working with the UNHCR, IOM, African Union, and civil society to develop safer, more collaborative solutions. This could include voluntary return programs with proper reintegration support, third country resettlement mechanisms coordinated through the UN legal pathways for work, study, or asylum in lieu of forced removals, joint migration monitoring centers to assess returnee conditions. Such an approach would require a fundamental shift in policy, from viewing migrants as threats to be expelled to human beings with rights, agency, and potential contributions to host and home societies alike. Recommendations for policy alternatives. To break the cycle of forced returns and unilateral enforcement, migration experts across Africa and the diaspora are proposing several forward-looking policy reforms. 1. Regional return agreements with human rights guarantees. Rather than ad hoc deportation deals, African regional blocs, e.g., ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, could negotiate collective return protocols that include full pre-return assessments, independent monitoring of post-return conditions, support packages for housing, employment, and psychosocial care, legal safeguards against arbitrary statelessness. 2. African migrant legal defense funds. Governments and philanthropies can fund legal assistance for African migrants abroad to ensure access to representation, appeals, and protection from unlawful removals. Such efforts already exist in parts of Europe and could be expanded. 3. Diaspora-led advocacy councils. The African diaspora in the US, Canada, and Europe can form permanent advisory councils to engage with foreign policymakers, monitor deportation practices, and document abuses in detention and return processes. 4. Digital identity and tracking systems. To prevent cases of wrongful deportation and facilitate voluntary returns, Africa needs a secure digital migrant registry system to track its nationals abroad, verify identities, and coordinate consular assistance. Data gaps and the politics of numbers. A significant challenge in the current debate is the lack of transparent data. Neither the U.S. government nor partner African states have released comprehensive figures on how many migrants are targeted for removal to each country. the legal status and nationality breakdown of deportees, the specific return arrangements being negotiated or finalized, the outcomes of prior deportations to volatile regions. In the absence of credible data, misinformation spreads rapidly, fueling xenophobia, undermining policy design, and obscuring accountability. Think tanks such as the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, and African Center for Strategic Studies, ACSS, have called for open access databases that document cross border returns, monitor human rights risks, and provide early warning indicators for unsafe deportations. Psychological impact, trauma, stigma, and displacement. After deportation beyond the legal, political, and economic dimensions of forced deportations lies a deeply human cost, the psychological toll on migrants and their families. For many deportees, especially those returned to volatile environments like Libya, the experience is not just a physical removal, but a profound rupture of identity, safety, and future prospects. The trauma of forced return psychologists and social workers who have worked with deportees consistently report high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety among those forcibly returned from the United States. The deportation process itself, marked by sudden arrest, detention, lack of legal clarity, and shackled removals, is often traumatic. When deportees arrive in countries like Libya, they frequently face violence or harassment from local militias, detention in substandard or abusive facilities, extortion by smugglers or corrupt officials, social isolation due to stigma or statelessness, difficulty accessing employment or health care. A 2023 joint report by Doctors Without Borders, MSF, and the Global Mental Health Institute found that over 68% of migrants deported to Libya experienced a severe mental health crisis within 6 months of return, with many lacking access to any form of psychosocial support. Intergenerational impact on families. For migrants with children born or raised in the United States, deportation can permanently fracture families. In many cases, U.S.-born children remain with relatives or enter foster care, while deported parents struggle to maintain contact across borders and hostile environments. The American Psychological Association has warned that children of deported parents face increased risks of behavioral and emotional disorders, declining academic performance, housing instability, long-term trust issues with government institutions. In African societies where familial reputation is central, deportees may also be ostracized by their communities, accused of bringing shame or failure upon their families. This cultural dimension is often overlooked in U.S. immigration policy, yet it significantly shapes the reintegration experience. First-hand testimonies, voices from the margins. Samuel, a Nigerian deported to Libya in 2022. They told me I was going back to a safe place, but I was detained by armed men the moment I got off the plane. No one knew where I was for weeks. They beat us, took our money. I came back with nothing. My family thinks I am cursed. Fatmata, a Sierra Leonean migrant mother. My daughter was born in New Jersey. They took me in an early morning raid. I begged them not to separate us. They said she could stay. Now she's in foster care. I call once a month when I can borrow a phone. I cry after every call. Musa, a Guinean community organizer in Chicago. We've lost brothers, friends, husbands. The U.S. system treats African migrants as invisible, even when they contribute to society. The deportation flights are like ghosts. We only hear about them when it's too late. These testimonies underscore the human rights and dignity crisis underpinning the deportation debate. Each removed person carries with them a story of hope, struggle, and betrayal that should not be silenced in the name of policy expediency. From deterrence to dignity, a paradigm shift in migration. At the heart of the Libya deportation crisis lies a fundamental question. Should migration management be rooted in fear and deterrence or in dignity and cooperation? Critics argue that deterrence based strategies, such as mass deportations to dangerous zones, cash incentives for voluntary exits, and indefinite detention, are ineffective, expensive, and inhumane. Not only do they fail to stop migration flows, but they also erode the moral authority of democratic states and foster global resentment. A dignity based approach, by contrast, calls for expanded legal pathways for migration, investment in migrant integration and labor mobility agreements, support for returnees, including trauma care and economic reintegration, genuine dialogue with origin countries centered on rights and shared development goals. This approach is not just morally superior, it is more sustainable in the long term. By addressing root causes of migration, poverty, conflict, climate change, and by treating migrants as partners in global progress, nations can build resilient migration systems that benefit both sending and receiving countries. International institutions and global accountability, a call to action. As deportation policies become increasingly aggressive and transnational in scope, the role of international institutions is more crucial than ever. Organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, IOM, African Union, AU, and various global civil society coalitions must now shift from advisory roles to enforcement mechanisms to ensure migrant protection standards are not hollow promises. UNHCR and the principle of non-refoulement. UNHCR has repeatedly affirmed that Libya is not a safe country for returns. Yet, without enforcement authority, its warnings are often ignored. There is now a growing call for the UN General Assembly or the Human Rights Council to establish special rapporteurs to investigate forced deportations to conflict zones, convene urgent briefings with Security Council members and deporting nations, strengthen sanctions or naming and shaming tools for countries that violate international protection norms, IOM, and ethical return programs. The IOM has had some success in operating voluntary return and reintegration programs, particularly in Europe. However, it must now resist being co opted into legitimizing forced deportations under the guise of voluntary returns. The IOM's credibility hinges on its ability to draw a firm ethical boundary between assistance and complicity. African Union, beyond silence. The African Union must assert its agency in this conversation. Africa cannot be both the continent of the future and the dumping ground of global deportation deals. The AU Peace and Security Council, in collaboration with the AU Commission on Social Affairs, should issue a continental position rejecting unsafe returns to African states, establish a migrant protection charter binding on member states, create a continental returnee fund to support reintegration and advocacy, civil society and legal networks, from Nairobi to New York, Johannesburg to Geneva, African legal scholars, journalists, and advocacy organizations are working across borders to document deportation abuses, challenge unlawful removals, and support survivors. Their success depends on stable funding, access to data, and solidarity from African governments. Building a global legal firewall against mass deportations will require coordinated litigation, policy lobbying, and storytelling that centers the migrant experience. Final thoughts and advice to African leaders. As this unfolding crisis demonstrates, Africa stands at a crossroads, not just as a passive recipient of global power plays, but as a co-architect of a new international migration order. African leaders must recognize that their silence or acquiescence in the face of exploitative deportation arrangements compromises sovereignty, endangers lives, and undermines the Pan-African vision of unity and dignity. To that end, the Bold African Voice, BAV, offers the following counsel. 1. Reject all deportation agreements that lack transparency, legal safeguards, and post-return support. 2. Engage diaspora communities as strategic partners in shaping migration policies, not as political burdens. 3. Invest in reintegration systems to support returning nationals and prevent cycles of migration fueled by shame and hopelessness. 4. Champion continental legal reforms that protect African migrants from being used as bargaining chips in geopolitical games. 5. Use AU platforms to build a unified stance on global migration governance and defend the right of every African to safety, dignity, and opportunity wherever they reside. Key takeaways. A U.S. judge has temporarily blocked deportations of migrants to Libya, citing due process violations and safety concerns. Libya, mired in conflict and human rights abuses, has rejected being used as a destination for U.S. deportees. Several African countries have reportedly been approached to accept deportees, sparking diplomatic, legal, and civil society backlash. The deportation debate raises critical issues about the future of African sovereignty, diaspora rights, and global migration governance. International institutions and African leaders must rise to the challenge and ensure that migration policies reflect justice, not expediency. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV. We urge our African leaders to rise, speak boldly, and protect the dignity of every African, home or abroad. If this message matters to you, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story that affects the continent. Remember, together we make the difference. Until next time, stay informed, stay bold,